The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Veterans Affairs office in San Diego when Sarah Martinez stepped out of her beat-up Honda Civic. She wore a simple black t-shirt, faded jeans, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with her modest appearance. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held a distant look that many veterans recognized in each other. Sarah had been coming to this VA office for 3 months now, trying to get her disability benefits sorted out. The paperwork was a nightmare, and every visit seemed to bring new complications. Today was supposed to be different. Today, she finally had all the documents they'd requested, including her medical records and service documentation. Inside the sterile government building, Sarah took a number and sat in the familiar waiting area. The plastic chairs were uncomfortable, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. She watched other veterans come and go, some in wheelchairs, others with visible injuries, and many more like herself who carried invisible wounds. When her number was finally called, Sarah approached the counter where a middle-aged clerk named Janet sat behind bulletproof glass. Janet had processed Sarah's case before and knew her story. Sarah claimed to be a former Navy SEAL, discharged after a mission went wrong in Afghanistan. It was an unusual claim for a woman, especially one who looked so young and ordinary. "Ms. Martinez," Janet said, looking over her glasses, "I've reviewed your file again, and I have to be honest with you. There are some inconsistencies in your story that we can't ignore anymore." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she remained calm. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Janet pulled out a thick folder and opened it. "Well, for starters, the Navy SEAL teams you claim to have served with don't have any record of you. The dates you've given us don't match up with known operations in that region, and frankly, your appearance and demeanor don't match what we'd expect from someone with your claimed background." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah had heard variations of this doubt before, not just here at the VA, but everywhere she went. People looked at her and saw a small woman with a soft voice and gentle manner. They didn't see a warrior. They couldn't imagine her in combat gear, carrying a rifle, making life or death decisions in the mountains of Afghanistan. "I understand your skepticism," Sarah said quietly, "but everything I've told you is true. I have my discharge papers, my medical records, and documentation of my service." Janet shook her head. "Anyone can forge documents these days. And stolen valor is a serious crime, Ms. Martinez. We've had several cases this year of people pretending to be special forces to get benefits they don't deserve." Behind Sarah, other veterans in the waiting area began to take notice of the conversation. Some looked sympathetic, understanding the frustration of dealing with VA bureaucracy. Others seemed suspicious, wondering if they were witnessing someone trying to game the system. "Ma'am, I'm not pretending to be anything," Sarah said, her voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. "I served my country for 6 years. I was wounded in action and medically discharged. I deserve the same consideration as any other veteran." But Janet wasn't convinced. She had already made up her mind about Sarah weeks ago. The young woman's story was just too unlikely, too convenient. Female Navy SEALs were extremely rare, and most of them didn't look like the woman standing in front of her. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait here while I make a phone call," Janet said, picking up her phone. "Security will be with you in a moment." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had been through interrogations before, but this was different. This was her own country, her own people, questioning her honor and her service. She remained standing at the counter, her hands clasped behind her back in a military posture that came naturally after years of training. Within minutes, 2 security guards arrived, followed by a San Diego police officer who had been called to the scene. The officer, a tall man in his 40s named Detective Rodriguez, approached Sarah with a mixture of professionalism and skepticism. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Rodriguez with SDPD. We've received a complaint that you may be impersonating a member of the military to fraudulently obtain benefits. That's a federal crime under the Stolen Valor Act." Sarah looked around the waiting room, now filled with staring eyes. Some veterans shook their heads in disgust, assuming she was just another faker trying to cash in on their sacrifice. Others remained silent, uncertain of what to believe. "I'm not impersonating anyone, Detective," Sarah said. "I am exactly who I say I am." Detective Rodriguez had dealt with stolen valor cases before, and they always followed a similar pattern. The imposters were usually men who had never served, spinning elaborate tales of heroism and special operations. But female SEALs were so rare that he had never encountered a case like this before. "Do you have identification?" he asked. Sarah handed over her driver's license and military ID card. The detective examined them carefully, but in an age of sophisticated forgeries, even official-looking documents could be fake. "These look legitimate, but we'll need to verify them," Rodriguez said. "In the meantime, I'm going to have to place you under arrest for suspected stolen valor fraud." The words echoed through the waiting room like a gunshot. Sarah felt the handcuffs click around her wrists as the detective read her Miranda rights. The cold metal was a stark contrast to the warm California sun streaming through the windows. As she was led through the lobby, Sarah held her head high despite the shame and humiliation. She had faced enemy fire, survived IED explosions, and lost good friends in combat. But this betrayal by her own people, her own government, cut deeper than any physical wound. The other veterans in the waiting room watched in silence as she was escorted out. Some whispered among themselves, debating whether justice was being served or an injustice was being committed. None of them could have imagined that within hours, this routine arrest would become one of the most talked about cases in military circles across the country. Outside, Detective Rodriguez helped Sarah into the back of his police car. As they drove toward the station, she stared out the window at the city she had once sworn to protect, wondering if her sacrifice had been worth it after all. Detective Rodriguez sat across from Sarah Martinez in the sterile interrogation room at the San Diego Police Department. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the gray walls. Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded on the metal table, still maintaining the military bearing that had become second nature to her. "Ms. Martinez, let's start from the beginning," Rodriguez said, opening a manila folder containing the sparse information they had gathered. "You claim to have served as a Navy SEAL from 2015 to 2021. That would make you one of the first women to complete SEAL training." Sarah nodded slowly. "I was part of an experimental program. The details are still classified, but women were being tested for special operations roles. I was one of only 3 who made it through the entire pipeline." The detective had done his homework during the drive to the station. He knew that in recent years, the military had begun opening more roles to women, including some special operations positions, but Navy SEAL teams remained one of the most exclusive and secretive units in the armed forces. "The problem is we can't verify any of this," Rodriguez continued. "The Navy has no record of you in their SEAL program. The units you claim to have served with say they've never heard of you. Your supposed commanding officers either don't exist or deny knowing you." Sarah's expression remained calm, but inside, her heart was racing. She had known this day would come eventually. The nature of her service, the classified operations, the need-to-know basis on which everything operated, made it nearly impossible to prove her identity through normal channels. "Detective, with respect, the operations I was involved in were black ops, off-the-books missions that officially never happened. The people I served with used code names. The missions we completed were classified at levels that most military personnel never see." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying, her face for tells. He had interviewed hundreds of suspects over his career, and he was good at spotting liars. But Sarah Martinez was different. Her story never changed, even under pressure. Her military knowledge seemed genuine, and she displayed a calm under interrogation that was unusual for someone facing federal charges. "Tell me about Afghanistan," he said, "specifically about the mission where you were wounded." Sarah's eyes grew distant, and for the first time, Rodriguez saw a crack in her composed exterior. Her hand unconsciously moved to her left shoulder, where underneath her shirt a network of surgical scars told a story of trauma and survival. "It was October 2019, she began, her voice quieter now. "We were tracking a high-value target in the mountains near the Pakistan border. Intelligence suggested he was planning an attack on American forces. My team was inserted by helicopter under cover of darkness. As Sarah spoke, Rodriguez noticed her breathing change. Her descriptions were vivid and detailed, filled with military jargon and tactical knowledge that would be difficult to fake. She described the smell of diesel fuel from the helicopter, the weight of her gear, the way the thin mountain air made every breath a struggle. The target wasn't where intelligence said he would be, Sarah continued. It was an ambush. They knew. We were coming. My team leader was hit first, then our communications specialist. I returned fire and tried to establish a defensive position, but there were too many of them. Rodriguez found himself drawn into the story despite his skepticism. Sarah's account had the ring of truth, complete with the kind of painful details that haunted real combat veterans. An IED went off about 20 meters from my position, she said, her hand moving to her shoulder again. Shrapnel tore through my left side. I lost consciousness for several minutes. When I came to, the firefight was still going on, but backup had arrived. Who was your team leader? Rodriguez asked. Sarah hesitated for a moment. That information is classified. I can't give you names without proper authorization. This was the crux of the problem. Everything about Sarah's story led back to classified information that couldn't be verified through normal channels. Either she was telling the truth about serving in highly secret operations, or she had constructed an elaborate lie that was impossible to disprove. Rodriguez excused himself from the room and made several phone calls. He contacted the FBI's military, fraud division, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and even reached out to contacts he had in the intelligence community. Each call yielded the same result. No one could confirm or deny Sarah Martinez's story. When he returned to the interrogation room, Sarah was sitting exactly as he had left her, staring at the wall with the 1,000-yard stare that many combat veterans recognized. Ms. Martinez, I've made some calls. The problem is that no one can verify your story, but no one can definitively disprove it either. What I can tell you is that the documents you've provided are sophisticated. If they're forgeries, they're the best I've ever seen. Sarah looked at him directly for the first time since the interrogation began. Detective, I understand your position. You have a job to do and stolen valor is a serious crime. But I am not a criminal. I am a veteran who served her country with honor and distinction. I was wounded in combat, and I deserve the benefits that were promised to me when I enlisted. Rodriguez felt his certainty beginning to waver. He had been sure when he arrested Sarah that he was dealing with another stolen valor case, but the more he talked to her, the less convinced he became that she was lying. Her knowledge was too deep, her composure too genuine, her story too consistent. There's something else, Rodriguez said, pulling out his phone. I've been in contact with the VA office where you were arrested. They've agreed to have a military liaison come in to evaluate your case. Someone with high-level security clearance who might be able to verify information that regular channels can't. Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly. This was unexpected. Most stolen valor cases were straightforward, resolved quickly with a few phone calls to military records offices. The fact that they were bringing in someone with high-level clearance suggested that her case was being taken more seriously than she had hoped. When will this person arrive? She asked. Within the hour, Rodriguez replied. Until then, you'll have to remain in custody. I can't release you on your own recognizance with federal charges pending. As Rodriguez left the room again, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming next. She thought about her teammates, the ones who hadn't made it home, and wondered if they would approve of the fight she was about to wage to prove her own worth and service. Outside the interrogation room, Rodriguez spoke quietly with his sergeant about the unusual nature of the case. Neither man had ever encountered a stolen valor suspect who seemed so credible, so genuine in their claims. As they waited for the military liaison to arrive, both officers found themselves hoping that Sarah Martinez was telling the truth, even if it meant their investigation had been wrong from the start. The San Diego Police Department's atmosphere shifted when Admiral Patricia Hayes walked through the front doors. At 55, she commanded attention without saying a word. Her Navy dress uniform was perfectly pressed, ribbons and medals creating a colorful display of decades of service. Detective Rodriguez had expected a military liaison, But he hadn't expected someone of this rank to respond personally to what seemed like a routine stolen valor case. Admiral Hayes was no ordinary officer. She had spent the last 15 years overseeing some of the Navy's most classified programs, including experimental training initiatives and special operations that existed in the gray areas between official military policy and operational necessity. Her security clearance was among the highest in the military, and her reputation for discretion was legendary. "Detective Rodriguez," she said, extending a firm handshake. "I understand you have someone in custody claiming to be a former Navy SEAL." "Yes, ma'am, Sarah Martinez. She's been trying to get VA benefits for months, claiming she served in special operations in Afghanistan. When we couldn't verify her service, we arrested her for stolen valor." Admiral Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "May I see her file?" As Rodriguez handed over the folder, Hayes scanned the documents with the practiced eye of someone who had reviewed thousands of military records. Her expression remained neutral, but something in the paperwork caught her attention. "These discharge papers," she said, pointing to a specific form. "The authorization code's at the bottom. Where did she get these?" Rodriguez shrugged. "She claims they're legitimate. We assume they're sophisticated forgeries." Hayes studied the codes more carefully. They were alphanumeric sequences that most people would dismiss as meaningless bureaucratic numbers. But to someone with her level of clearance, they told a different story. These codes corresponded to a program that officially didn't exist, a classified initiative that had been so secret that even its participants had been sworn to secrecy with the threat of court-martial hanging over their heads. "I need to speak with Ms. Martinez immediately," Hayes said, her tone suddenly more urgent. "Of course, Admiral, but I should warn you, she's been very consistent in her story, but we haven't been able to verify any of it through normal channels." "Detective, sometimes normal channels are inadequate for extraordinary circumstances." Hayes followed Rodriguez through the station's corridors to the interrogation room. When the door opened, Sarah looked up from the table where she had been sitting in silence for the past hour. Her eyes immediately went to the Admiral's uniform, taking in the rank insignia and ribbons with the trained eye of someone who understood what they meant. "Ms. Martinez," Admiral Hayes said, taking a seat across from her. "I'm Admiral Hayes. I understand you've been having some difficulties proving your service record." Sarah straightened in her chair, instinctively adopting military, bearing in the presence of a superior officer. "Yes, ma'am. My service was classified and I've been unable to provide verification through standard channels." Admiral Hayes opened the folder and spread Sarah's documents across the table. "Tell me about Program Shadow Wolf." The effect on Sarah was immediate and dramatic. Her eyes widened and she drew in a sharp breath. Program Shadow Wolf was the code name for the experimental special operations program she had been part of, a name that was supposed to be known only to a handful of people at the highest levels of government. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm authorized to discuss that program," Sarah said carefully. "You're authorized to discuss it with me," Hayes replied. "In fact, I'm ordering you to discuss it with me. What was your designation in Shadow Wolf?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking around the room. Detective Rodriguez was still present, along with another officer who had been taking notes. These weren't people with security clearances. "Ma'am, respectfully, there are people present who may not have need-to-know authorization." Admiral Hayes nodded approvingly. Even under arrest, facing federal charges, Sarah was still protecting classified information. It was exactly the kind of discipline that had been drilled into Shadow Wolf participants. "Detective Rodriguez, I need you and your officer to step outside for a few minutes. What I'm about to discuss with Ms. Martinez is classified at levels that require specific authorization." Rodriguez looked confused but complied with the Admiral's request. As the door closed behind them, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. "Operator 7, Sarah said quietly, giving her Shadow Wolf designation. "Operator 7, Admiral," Hayes repeated, consulting a mental list she had memorized years ago. "Also known as Phoenix during field operations. Recruited from Naval Special Warfare Development Group in 2015. Completed modified SEAL training at an undisclosed location. Deployed to Afghanistan with Team Bravo for high-value target operations." Sarah's composure finally cracked. Tears welled. up in her eyes as she realized that someone finally knew who she really was, someone who could vouch for her service and sacrifice. "Ma'am, it's been so hard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one believes me. They look at me and see someone who couldn't possibly be a SEAL. The VA treats me like a fraud. I've been fighting for months just to get the medical care I need." Admiral Hayes reached across the table and placed her hand on Sarah's arm. "I know, Operator 7. The program was designed to be deniable. We knew that might cause problems for participants later, but the operational security requirements were paramount." "My team leader, Rodriguez," Sarah said, using the code name of her deceased commander. "He told us we might never be able to prove what we did, that our service might remain invisible forever. I thought I understood what that meant. But living, it is different." "Rodriguez was a good man," Hayes said sadly. "I was at his funeral. Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60. You were still in the hospital at Walter Reed, recovering from your wounds." The mention of her team leader's death brought back a flood of memories for Sarah. The guilt she carried for being the only survivor of that final mission, the months of rehabilitation, the struggle to readjust to civilian life without being able to talk to anyone about what she had experienced. "The program was officially terminated in 2021, Admiral Hayes explained. "Budget cuts, political considerations, and frankly, some resistance from traditional military leadership who weren't ready for female operators in those roles. The handful of women who completed the program were quietly transferred to other assignments or medically retired." "Why is Shadow Wolf still classified?" Sarah asked. "Because it worked too well," Hayes replied. "The female operators in the program were incredibly effective. In some environments, particularly in the Middle East, women could go places and do things that male operators couldn't. But acknowledging the program's success would have required admitting that we had been underutilizing half the population for decades." Admiral Hayes stood up and walked to the small window in the interrogation room. Outside, San Diego was going about its normal business, unaware that in this small room, a woman's entire future was being decided. "Ms. Martinez, your service was real. Your sacrifice was real. Your wounds were real. The fact that your government can't officially acknowledge what you did doesn't diminish any of that." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What happens now, ma'am?" "Now, Admiral," Hayes said, turning back to face her, "I'm going to make some phone calls. And Detective Rodriguez is going to learn that sometimes the most important truths are the ones that can't be found in any official database." Admiral Hayes walked to the door and motioned for Detective Rodriguez to return. The confusion on his face was evident as he took in the changed dynamic in the room. "Detective," the Admiral said, "you're about to release Ms. Martinez with a full apology. And then we're going to discuss how to ensure she gets every benefit and service she has earned through her distinguished service to this country." Detective Rodriguez stared at Admiral Hayes in bewilderment as she made her pronouncement about releasing Sarah Martinez. Everything about this case had been turned upside down in the span of a 20-minute conversation he wasn't allowed to witness. "Admiral, with all due respect, I need some explanation here," Rodriguez said. "An hour ago, we had what appeared to be a clear-cut case of stolen valor fraud. Now you're telling me to release her with an apology?" Admiral Hayes understood his confusion. She had spent her career dealing with classified information and the complications it created in the civilian world. But this situation required more than just pulling rank. "Detective, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room without proper authorization. Ms. Martinez was indeed a Navy SEAL, but her service was part of a classified program that officially doesn't exist. The reason you couldn't verify her service through normal channels is because those channels were never supposed to have records of it." Sarah remained silent, watching the exchange between the two. She could see Rodriguez struggling to process this information, trying to reconcile what he had been told with what he was now learning. If her service was legitimate, why didn't she just say that from the beginning? Rodriguez asked. "Because she was following her training," Hayes replied. "Even under arrest, even facing federal charges, she protected classified information. That level of discipline is exactly what we'd expect from someone who went through the Shadow Wolf program." Admiral Hayes turned to Sarah. Ms. Martinez, I'm going to need you to show Detective Rodriguez something that will help him understand the reality of your service. Sarah looked uncertain. Ma'am, what did you have in mind? Your tattoo, Operator 7, the one on your left shoulder blade. Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her back. The tattoo Admiral Hayes was referring to wasn't just body art. It was a mark of membership in one of the military's most elite and secretive units. But it was hidden beneath her shirt, and she had never shown it to anyone outside the program. Ma'am, is that necessary? Sarah asked. I'm afraid it is. Detective Rodriguez needs proof that goes beyond documentation. And frankly, the VA is going to need the same level of proof to process your benefits properly. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then stood up and turned her back to the two officers. She lifted her shirt slightly, revealing the upper part of her left shoulder blade. There, in black ink, was a tattoo that made Admiral Hayes nod with recognition and caused Detective Rodriguez to draw in a sharp breath. The tattoo was a stylized phoenix rising from flames, but it wasn't the artistic design that caught their attention. Incorporated into the flames were symbols and numbers that looked like random marks to most people, but to those in the know, they told a specific story. The symbols indicated Sarah's unit designation, her training completion date, and her operational status. Most significantly, embedded in the Phoenix's wing was a small trident, the symbol of Navy SEALs. But this one was different. It had subtle modifications that marked it as belonging to the Shadow Wolf program. Jesus, Rodriguez muttered under his breath. That tattoo can only be applied by one person, Admiral Hayes explained. A Navy Master Chief who works exclusively with special operations programs. The ink itself contains specialized materials that show up under certain types of scanning equipment. It's literally impossible to forge. Sarah lowered her shirt and turned back around. The tattoo was applied after my first deployment, she said quietly. It was explained to us as a way to identify us if our bodies were ever recovered in circumstances where normal identification wasn't possible. The grim reality of that statement hung in the air. These weren't soldiers who expected to die peacefully in their beds. They were operators who went into situations where death was a very real possibility, and their identities might need to be protected even after death. Admiral Hayes pulled out her phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, she had arranged for a portable scanner to be brought to the police station. The technology was typically used by military medical personnel to identify remains, but it would serve their purposes here. While we wait for that equipment, let me explain what Shadow Wolf was really about, Hayes said, taking a seat. After 9/11, the military realized that our enemies weren't playing by traditional rules. We needed operators who could blend into environments where conventional soldiers stood out. Women, it turned out, had significant advantages in certain cultural contexts. She continued. The program started with 40 candidates, all of them already serving in various military capacities. They went through modified SEAL training, enhanced with specialized skills for operating in environments where gender could be an advantage rather than a liability. Detective Rodriguez found himself fascinated despite his initial skepticism. How many completed the program? 3, Admiral Hayes said simply. The training was brutal, designed to weed out everyone except those with the absolute highest levels of physical and mental toughness. Sarah was the youngest to complete the program and the most effective in the field. Within an hour, the scanning equipment arrived. A Navy technician set it up in the interrogation room and asked Sarah to expose the tattoo again. The scanner looked like a sophisticated camera, but when it was activated, the tattoo revealed details that were invisible to the naked eye. Numbers and letters appeared on the screen, providing a complete record of Sarah's service that was encoded in the ink itself. Her real name, her service dates, her operational deployments, even her medical discharge information were all there, stored in a format that was impossible to replicate. My God, Rodriguez said, staring at the screen. I've never seen anything like this. It's technology that's been in development for years, the technician explained. Originally designed for intelligence operatives who might need to prove their identity in situations where conventional documentation couldn't be trusted. Admiral Hayes studied the information displayed on the screen. Everything here confirms Ms. Martinez's story. She served with distinction in one of the military's most challenging programs. She was wounded in action while completing a mission that helped prevent terrorist attacks on American forces. She deserves our thanks, not our suspicion. Detective Rodriguez felt a mixture of embarrassment and admiration. He had arrested a genuine war hero, someone who had risked everything for her country and then been forced to defend her own honor when that country failed to recognize her service. Ms. Martinez, I owe you an apology, he said. A sincere, heartfelt apology. What happened today should never have happened to someone who served as you did. Sarah nodded, accepting his apology with the grace that came from understanding that Rodriguez had just been doing his job. Thank you, Detective. I know this situation was unusual for everyone involved. Admiral Hayes was already making more phone calls, this time to people at the VA and the Pentagon. Within hours, Sarah's benefits would be expedited, her medical care would be prioritized, and most importantly, her service would finally be properly recognized. As the scanner was packed away and the official paperwork was completed, Admiral Hayes pulled Sarah aside for a private moment. Operator 7, your war isn't over, she said quietly. There are other Shadow Wolf veterans out there struggling with the same issues you faced. They need someone to advocate for them, someone who understands what they went through. Are you interested in that mission? Sarah straightened her shoulders, and for the first time in months she felt like she had a purpose again. Yes, ma'am. I am. Outside the police station, the California sun was setting over San Diego Bay. Sarah Martinez walked out a free woman, her honor restored, her service acknowledged, and her future filled with new possibilities for serving her fellow veterans. 3 days after Sarah Martinez walked out of the San Diego Police Department, her story exploded across national media. What started as a routine police blotter item about a stolen valor arrest had transformed into a front-page story that raised uncomfortable questions about how America treats its veterans, particularly those who served in classified programs. The story broke when a junior reporter at the San Diego Union Tribune noticed an unusual correction in the police department's weekly crime report. Instead of the typical charges dropped due to lack of evidence, Sarah's case was listed as charges dismissed, service verified by Naval Command. The reporter, Maria Santos, sensed there was more to the story and began making phone calls. Sarah was at her small apartment in Chula Vista when her phone started ringing constantly. She had been trying to process everything that had happened, finally feeling some relief that her service had been acknowledged. But she wasn't prepared for the media attention that was about to descend on her life. Ms. Martinez, this is Maria Santos from the Union Tribune. I understand you were arrested for stolen valor, but the charges were dropped. Can you comment on what happened? Sarah's first instinct was to say nothing. Years of training had taught her to keep operational details secret, and she wasn't sure what she was allowed to discuss publicly, but Admiral Hayes had given her specific guidance before leaving San Diego. I can confirm that I was arrested based on a misunderstanding about my military service, Sarah said carefully. The matter has been resolved, and I'm grateful for the professionalism shown by both the San Diego Police Department and the Navy in addressing the situation. But Maria Santos wasn't satisfied with the generic response. She had spent hours researching Sarah's story, trying to piece together the inconsistencies that had led to the arrest in the first place. What she found was a puzzle that didn't make sense unless there were missing pieces. Ms. Martinez, my research shows that there's no public record of your service with Navy SEAL teams, yet high-ranking naval officers have vouched for your service. Can you explain this discrepancy? Sarah hesitated. Admiral Hayes had told her she could discuss certain aspects of her service, but the boundaries weren't entirely clear. My service involved classified programs. I'm not at liberty to discuss operational details, but I can say that my record of service is accurate and has been verified by appropriate military authorities. The story that appeared in the next morning's newspaper was carefully written, but explosive in its implications. Santos had done her homework, interviewing military experts, veterans advocates, and legal scholars about the complexities of classified military service and how it affected veterans' benefits. By noon, Sarah's phone was ringing with calls from national news networks. CNN, Fox News, NBC, and others all wanted interviews with the woman who had been arrested for impersonating a SEAL, only to have an admiral personally verify her service. The story had all the elements that made for compelling television. A female, veteran, secret military programs, bureaucratic failures, and questions about how America treats its heroes. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the attention. She had spent years living in anonymity, her service unknown to everyone except a handful of people with the highest security clearances. Now her face was appearing on television screens across the country. Admiral Hayes called her on the second day of the media blitz. "How are you holding up, Sarah?" "Honestly, ma'am, this is harder than combat," Sarah replied. "At least in Afghanistan I knew who the enemy was." Hayes laughed. "The media isn't your enemy, but they're not necessarily your friend either. They're looking for a story, and you happen to be at the center of a very compelling one. The question is, what story do you want to tell?" "I'm not sure I understand, ma'am." "Sarah, there are dozens of other Shadow Wolf veterans out there facing the same problems you faced. Their service is invisible, their sacrifices unrecognized. You have an opportunity to shine a light on their situation. The choice is yours, but this media attention could be a powerful tool for helping your fellow veterans." That evening, Sarah agreed to her first television interview. She chose to appear on a PBS program known for its serious approach to military issues, rather than the more sensational cable news shows that had been pursuing her. The interview was conducted by veteran journalist Patricia Williams, who had covered military affairs for over 20 years. Williams understood the delicate balance between public interest and operational security. "Sarah, thank you for joining us. Let's start with the basics. Can you tell us about your military service?" Sarah had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times over the past few days. "I served in the Navy for 6 years, from 2015 to 2021. During that time, I was part of special operations units that conducted missions in Afghanistan and other locations. I was wounded in action and medically discharged. But your service was part of a classified program, which is why it couldn't be verified through normal channels." "That's correct. The nature of the operations required a high level of secrecy. Participants in these programs understood that our service might never